Welcome, everybody. And on behalf of these two guys, just to say thanks for coming and being part of the conversation. We hope the hour is fruitful for you all as we get into some of these things. I want to actually start off by picking back up on the introductions for a little bit, because while you got some of the layers on that, I think some of the deeper texture is really important to hear a little bit from these two guys. Dr. Heimbach served in Vietnam, or in the Vietnam War, in the Navy. And also what was left out of that introduction was a part of, if not the chief architect for the just war policy that George Bush Sr. used in our invasion, or our war in Iraq. So Dan, talk to us a little bit about that for a few minutes. But before you do, Jeff has had many, as you heard, many live combat situations take place. Jeff has actually been in the first person context in which he has taken human life in a war context. And so I was going to ask Jeff so those would be some of the first questions, just to kind of give you a sense of who the guys are that we're talking to. So Dan, tell us a little bit about Vietnam and also your experience in the White House. If you can do that succinctly, that'd be awesome.
Well, actually, I'm going to start a little bit farther back.
Okay.
Because I was actually born in war in communist China. My folks were church planting missionaries in China who stayed there when it got dangerous, because God didn't call them to leave, and they stayed until they were then arrested and expelled from the country, and I was born in the midst of all that. So I was very much born in the midst of a war context. You want to know about the serving at the White House, and also...
Yeah, tell us a bit about what you were doing in the Navy during Vietnam, and then...
I had all my education in Southeast Asia in a mission boarding school, but came back to the States for junior high and high school, went to public high school in Wheaton, Illinois, and was really, I really felt like an outsider looking in the window. And I really wanted to credential myself as an American and feel like I was part of what was going on. And so I didn't think there could be any better way to do that than to join the military. And so I ended up getting a presidential appointment to the United States Naval Academy as an MK, which was really a miracle, because MKs don't have any political connections. But one thing led to another, and the Lord opened that door, and I was given that opportunity. And of course, that was during the Vietnam War, very much nation very, very divided as it is now over what's going on in the news and so forth like that. And marched in President Nixon's first inaugural when they were discussing what do we do if the hippies break up the ranks, that kind of stuff going on. And I'm kind of wondering, what's my role in all of this? Graduated, went straight over on a combatant to the Tonkin Gulf, and served in the last part of the Vietnam War. And it really, I had been praying about it. I wasn't running from God, and I really was really praying through. I knew God had led me there, but I couldn't answer the questions. I had some serious questions about how this all fit together, particularly since I was back in the part of the country where I had been raised, and my folks were putting their life on the line to share the gospel, people who had eternal destiny, and now I'm with a military combatant using deadly force to take the lives of people like that. And I'm thinking, how does that go together? And so my whole time on deployment was really Bible study, going through everything the Bible had to say. So that's what really got me interested in studying the ethics of war and peace. It was very, very much a personal drive for me. So after the Vietnam War, I resigned my commission, pursued higher education, did a PhD, and ended up in political Washington with a sense of missionary calling to engage the culture in moral witness at a time when the culture was turning its back on moral truth. So shining light in the darkness, engaging salt, in light, kind of a calling. So I had a practical experience in terms of bringing moral witness to bear, not just a theoretical one. So the theoretical study that I did was to equip me to be a better witness. And in the process, one thing led to another, and I ended up on the White House staff at a time when things were building up in the Persian Gulf War. And one of my specialties in my doctoral study was the ethics of war and peace, because of my background in the Vietnam War and working through that sort of thing. And so even though I was on the domestic side of the house, as things started to get, quite controversial, and there was a lot of debate in the news, and people saying, well, the president hasn't given us reasons for why he's sending troops over to Saudi Arabia and all of that. Inside conversation among the White House staff was, well, we're giving them reasons every day, in talking points and so forth like this. What do they mean they haven't given reasons? And so I responded to that and says, well, really what that means is they're looking for moral justification for what the president is doing. So they're not looking for economic and national, international stability kinds of things. They're looking for moral justification for what he's done. And I can give you an outline for those if you like. And they said, really? You can do that? So I said, sure, I'd be glad to. So I wasn't at a level where I could just volunteer that, but I offered it. And the chief of staff, who was Governor Sununu at the time, authorized me to write a personal memo to the president listing just war principles, which I did. And when you write the president a memo, you don't write a long dissertation. It has to be something very, very short with bullet points. But I got it back, and he had marked it up. I wish I'd kept it. But he sent it to the speechwriters. He was going to give a national address on what he was, on his leadership in the Middle East, and particularly the build-up of tension with Saddam Hussein. And so he sent my memo to the speechwriter and says, use that as an outline for a national address on my moral approach to what's going on. And so I called down there and said, what do you, who's it assigned to? Kurt Smith. Okay, talked to Kurt. Says, how you doing? He says, what is this just war stuff? I said, well, it's been around for a long time. He says, why don't you just simply write something up and I'll go over it and edit it, make sure you don't say anything, out of order. So he said, oh, that's good. So he felt a lot better about it after that. So that turned into the president's speech to the national religious broadcasters, which was a national speech about his leadership and his approach to leadership in the buildup in the Persian Gulf War. And after that, there was no more discussion about the president hasn't given reasons. Whether they agreed to it or not, he'd given reasons, moral justification. And the interesting thing was, up to that point, even though the just war tradition has been around a long, long time, it was thought to be passé and no longer relevant in the modern world, particularly with the advent of nuclear weapons and the extreme amount of destruction associated with that this ancient approach to war and peace couldn't possibly be relevant. And so it wasn't taught. It hadn't been taught for a couple of generations. I went to the Naval Academy, and they had nothing on the ethics of war and peace in the training of future officers. That was true of all the academies. It isn't true now. They do offer something, but at that point, they didn't have anything. It was kind of flying by the seat of your pants, and basically something called moral realism. You got to break a few eggs to make an omelet, kind of the McCain approach to war and peace. And but with that, there was a tremendous interest in the resurgence of the modern day application of just war in the modern world. And that was all sparked by my memo to the president and his use of it in the Persian Gulf War. So there's been a lot of discussion, people writing books, people having new ideas of what needs to be added and so forth. But that all is as a result of reintroducing the just war ethic in the modern world as a result of President Bush's leadership.
Okay, so if you're a treasure hunter, you just found one of the biggest pieces of gold on campus, right? I mean, what a story.
Yes,
and to think that the Lord would take a humble missionary kid who had to be smuggled out of China in order to save his life and use him to have that kind of international impact. Praise the Lord, Dan. Thank you. Yeah. And how in the world, this is a different conversation, how in the world you don't have that sheet of paper from the president? We're all wondering, but we'll save that for another time on that. Let me shift to Jeff. Jeff, tell us a little bit about what it's like to be a soldier in live fire being in a context where, what is it like emotionally to
Yeah.
take a human life and think through that?
Before I do that, though, I should say you've got two very competent theorists up here, but you also have two men that are personally touched by this. A father of an U.S. Army soldier, and then my experience is mainly in combat. So as you heard, I spent about 23 years in the Army. For 13 of those 23 years, I was an enlisted guy, and almost all of it in special operations as an infantry guy and a door kicker. I had a very solid Christian faith before joining the Army. I felt called to the military. I felt called to reach my buddies who were in the military, and I had some pretty intense combat experience. So from Panama to Desert Storm to Somalia, and there's an actor who plays me in the movie Black Hawk Down. I had this profound call to ministry after Somalia. I never saw this one coming. It was not at all on my radar. And I ended up going to school, leaving the military, coming back on active duty as a chaplain before the attacks on September 11th. And then my last several years in the Army, I deployed to Afghanistan to combat 9 times and 5 times to combat in Iraq. And I'm a guy who most of what I know about war is from the middle of it and in combat and getting shot at. And it is powerful, it is intense, and there's no way you wouldn't be impacted by just the blood and the violence around you, because I'm a guy who showed up to the military believing that every human being is created in the image of God with inherent value and worth. And have somebody on the opposite end of your rifle barrel and know, if I don't pull the trigger and I don't kill them, it's not me, it's not my buddies, it's our way of life, and it's the future of our country that's at stake. To have that kind of responsibility on your shoulders is overwhelming. And I have the greatest respect for guys and gals in the military, but also for first responders that get up every day and do this for us for a living, so that we can live in a country that we can have a conversation like this. It's kind of it in a very short nutshell.
So if you have Slido and that all of a sudden triggers some questions, these guys would be open to following those, depending on how much time we have at the end. So hopefully that just triggered some of that. We want to move into a discussion now to try to think through what does it mean from a Christian perspective to even have a just war perspective. So I'm going to throw it out to Dr. Heimbach first to just help us think through, Dan, what are some key biblical texts that you would use to frame your thinking, and perhaps maybe better said, Christian thinking about war and peace and how these work together? And then Jeff, if you feel you want to jump in.
Well, I teach a whole course on that, written on it. That's a very, very big target to hit, because the Bible says a lot of things relating to war and peace. It's a big theme. It's a big thing because obviously the ultimate war is a spiritual war with forces of evil aligned against forces of good, God and Satan and all of that. But that lies behind and influences everything that's happening in the world. And so one of its manifestations is in the way sinful people relate to each other and get along with each other. The interesting thing is that we all have this longing for order and peace and justice, and wouldn't it be nice if we could just get along together? But we can't. No matter how hard we try, even the best of us get into conflict situations that we feel we have to stand up and defend ourselves or defend somebody else. And there's a lot of folks who really don't care about being good, and they just have very strong ideas about what their self-interest is, and they're willing to take other people to the mat about it. It's just the way things are. We live in a fallen world, and we can imagine a world where everybody gets along, but that's not the real world. So it's a very big topic in the Bible. But I like the way the question is put, because what I found that most people start off with a point of view they prefer, and they look for Bible verses to support it and leave out the ones that don't support it. And what I prefer, and if you're learning good hermeneutics in this school, is let's start off assuming that you don't know what it should be, and let God tell you. Look at the whole sweep of Scripture, look at everything on the topic, and put it together. And that makes sense because it's written by human authors, but it's ultimately the divine author, which means that it's inerrant, and not only inerrant, but it hangs together. That's why it can be systematically studied. It would be crazy to try to do anything systematic with the Bible. It was just a bunch of books written over millennia by different people who didn't know each other to expect them to be consistent with each other. It would be impossible. So one of the strongest evidences for the divine source of the Bible is that it is coherent and hangs together, and therefore you can study it systematic. So you can take a topic like war and peace, pick all the pieces, and then look for how the pieces go together. So we're not free to interpret what one passage means in a way that would make it conflict with other passages in the Bible. So we've got that limits our options. And getting back, I can list a number of passages. Obviously, Jesus is for peace. Obviously, he is a Prince of Peace. Obviously, we look forward to a time when there won't be any war, and swords will be beaten into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks and those kinds of things. Isn't that wonderful? But that is after Jesus comes back the second time and starts the earthly dimension of his political kingdom. He came the first time and he took care of the sin problem and died for our sins. It wasn't, as some people have suggested, to start a new ethic of pacifism. That wasn't his purpose. That's inconsistent. And Jesus did not say government should never use deadly force. There's clearly verses in the Bible, not only in the Old Testament, where God authorizes kings to go to war, and obviously the people of God go in and take the Holy Land, and so forth like this, and obviously what they did was obeying God, so it couldn't have been sinful. But the ethic hasn't changed to the New Testament, the way some people think. Oh, Jesus came and he rebuked Peter, and as a result, from that point on, Christians can't bear the swords. That is totally out of context with everything Jesus taught and everything that was taught by the apostles afterward. Some of the earliest Christians in the first generation, like Cornelius, were full-time professional military officers, and they were never told to leave the profession. And even Jesus rebuking Peter, he did say something. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword, and there's some kind of a principle there. But we can't interpret that principle in a way that conflicts with what Jesus himself said half an hour before. In the upper room, he specifically told his disciples that after he was gone, that means after he was dead, buried, and back to heaven, and they were going on mission trips, they should take swords with them. And hopefully, which means they should use them if they needed to. You don't bring people to the gospel by threatening them with swords, but sometimes you're going to be in a dangerous situation. And if even an apostle sharing the gospel should be able to defend himself with deadly force if necessary, how much more should a nation? And it goes along with Paul saying that God says that the king is an agent of God to restrain evil and promote what's good, using the power of the sword, which is not given him for no reason. Okay, so there are lots of other things I could say, but
great running start on that. Jeff, let me ask you a specific question in relation to this. So the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill. Or does it say actually something more nuanced than that? Help us think that through.
Yeah, I have the privilege now, because I still live in a military town, of speaking to most of the brand new infantry officers and armor officers, the tankers in the Army. I speak to them usually in the first week or two, and I have this conversation with them, and I tell them, look, if you came from those old school King James only churches, you really have a bad interpretation of this Hebrew word. It specifically says murder. And we could parse out the root form of this word, but you cannot miss this from the books of Deuteronomy and Joshua when God lays out the promised land and these 6 cities of refuge. And in these cities of refuge, God fervently distinguishes between murder and killing. There's 2 guys in a field, somebody's dead, the guy who is alive runs to the city of refuge, and now the village elders have to investigate. If we find out that you murdered somebody, well, we're going to hand you over to the family. The avengers of blood are going to take an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and a life for a life. This is Old Testament justice, but not just Old Testament Israel justice. This is justice globally at the time. But if what we determined was killing, very different from murder, the same village elders will swear to protect your life, and they will protect you until the high priest is gone. You can't be any more clear about a distinction between murder and killing from the scriptures than the cities of refuge. And I try to describe for these future combat officers of the United States Army, there is a very clear distinction in God's eyes. However, legally, and using the law of land conflict and just war theory and the Geneva Convention, that gets muddled real quick when the enemy is about 10 feet away with their finger on the trigger, and you have to decide, am I gonna pull the trigger or not? So it's very easy to talk about in a classroom. It's a lot harder to do when you're on the battlefield.
Yeah, so the language that Jeff's referring to in the commandment there, the Hebrew word is ratzak, thou shalt not ratzak. The normal word for killing that's used in the Old Testament is the word muth, M-U-T-H. So what the commandment is saying is thou shalt not take a life unjustly, as opposed to God himself giving commandments for the people of Israel to take a life. So one of the questions that comes up from this is whether or not Jesus was a pacifist. And if you have a Trinitarian understanding of the Godhead, then the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are involved in telling the Israelites to go and take the land. So God himself is telling people to take life. So to make the argument that Jesus is a pacifist is actually a little bit contra to Trinitarian theology. So the question then is, what does Jesus say, turn the other cheek, when he tells us to not harm? There's a context in which that whole thing has to be written within a canonical reading of the scriptures from front to end. So if you want to ask if God is a pacifist, then you're asking probably the better question. The Trinity tells people to go to war in the Old Testament. The New Testament ends with the Trinity going to war, with the person of Jesus armed in Revelation 19. So in between then, the question is, can you do this justly as broken people? Okay, so that's kind of where we'll move to next, is to think this thing through a little bit. Typically... Can
I add a point?
Yeah,
to that?
please.
With regard to what Jeff said and what Dr. Liederbach said. The biggest problem with interpreting Jesus, and Jesus is the Prince of Peace. Jesus commands us to be at peace with each other and to get along with each other and so forth like this. But it's the peace that Jesus promises is in relationship to God, reconciling sinners with God, who is a death sentence over us, okay, and is required. He cannot compromise his holiness by not holding us accountable. So how do you reconcile sinners with God without compromising his holiness? And so Jesus is the answer to that. Jesus brings the offer of peace between sinners and God, who must punish sin. Okay, but when it comes to how we get along with other people in a fallen world, in a mixed society, and so forth, Jesus, the one place where Jesus used the word peace in the context in a way that clearly is referring to civil tranquility, he said, I did not come to bring peace but the sword. If you're going to be true to me, it's going to get people stirred up to the point of threatening your life. And if you're just going to do whatever it takes not to rile people up, you are going to be unfaithful to me. So Jesus makes that clear. But in the Old Testament, biblical ethics is not a philosophy. It's not a theory. It's a revelation of God's character. And the one thing the Bible makes clear about God's character is that he doesn't change. God is not inert. He's not a rock. He reacts. He's personable. He's grieved. He's pleased by what we do and so forth. But his character is unchanging. That's what it means when it's the same yesterday, today, and forever. That means his character never changes. And since ethics in the Bible is a revelation of how we are to behave in a way that's consistent with God's character, ethics can't change unless God's character changes. So the biggest problem with thinking that the New Testament teaches a different ethic than the Old Testament is the theological one that denies God's character doesn't change. Okay? The God in the Old Testament that sends Israel to war and obviously justifies, he requires capital punishment. And there's a very interesting verse, I didn't write it down, it's a very interesting verse in Ezekiel, I think it's Ezekiel 19, where the God of the sanctity of life, because what we're concerned about is being true to the sanctity of human life. And how can we be faithful to the sanctity of human life and go to war? Well, God, in that verse, is criticizing prophets or moral teachers of his day. And he's saying, you're twisting, you're bending, you are perverting my ethic of the sanctity of human life in two ways. You're violating it by killing those who shouldn't die. Okay, that's like killing life in the womb or something. You're killing innocent people who don't deserve to die and you're taking their life. But the other way is you're not putting to death those who should be killed. In other words, the one who gives us the right to life says you lose the right to life when you take another person's life unjustly. Then you deserve to die, and it's a violation of the sanctity of human life not to take your life. So that's very powerful.
Yeah, this is probably the best advertisement for our ethics classes that you can have here, right? To get these deeper conversations on this. So let me give you, you guys just a few categories to go to. Then I'm going to throw a question at Jeff that he's not prepared for, but it'll be fascinating to hear his thoughts on this. So as we think through, in the history of how Christian thought has developed on this, there's typically three large categories that people think through in regard to war. One of them is described as pacifism. A second one is known as just war, which the three of us hold to a just war perspective. A third category is a crusade mentality or a jihadist category on that. So let me speak real briefly to pacifism. Typically that shows up in two forms. One form would be total non-resistance altogether. So this would be a perspective that you should never intervene in any context. A second version of this is that you can have limited intervention but never violent. So the second version of that would be maybe you use your body as a shield, or maybe if a fight is taking place, you could go in and try to pull the people out who are innocent. So you could use force, but it's never a violent force against another human. So those would be two kind of versions. But the way they've been justified is several different ways. Some who are pacifists would rely on a passage of scripture like Psalm 20, verse 7, which says, some rely on horses, some on chariots, but we trust in the will of our God, in the power of our God. So those folks who are arguing from that, they would say something like this: we are going to be pacifists because God told us to. Whether or not we die is irrelevant. Okay? In that sense, while I don't agree with that position, we wouldn't describe that as heretical. We would just disagree with the way the text of Scripture is being used. There's a second view, though, that's more of a consequentialist kind of pacifism. This would be those held by people like John Lennon of the Beatles, who sang songs like "Imagine There's No Heaven and No Earth," or all we're saying is give peace a chance. This second version of pacifism would argue that we not only shouldn't kill, but the reason is if we just give peace a chance, human race will figure this out all by ourselves. So the reason it's heretical, it has a wrong view of human sin nature, which is what Dr. Heimbach was just talking about. Humans are broken and we are going to kill each other. It's a question of whether or not we can hold that down a little bit. There's two other versions that kind of build on those two, and I won't take the time to talk about those, but generally those are the ways that people try to work through a pacifistic side. Now we're going to get back to just war in just a little bit, but Jeff, I was going to ask you this question. One of the most interesting things for me as I think about you as a warrior is you're a just warrior. So a just warrior fights according to principles. There's things you simply can't do. There's limits to the amount of force you can use, those kinds of perspectives on that. But when you fight against a jihadist, When you fight against somebody with the crusader mentality, they're not following rules at all. So what's it like to engage where the two rules, the two sets of behavior are opposed to one another?
Great question. Almost all of the combat that I've experienced was with an enemy who doesn't share our ethics and doesn't share our commitment to the way we conduct ourselves on a battlefield. In other words, the United States has signed the Geneva Accords. We are part of the law of land conflict thinking worldwide, but the enemies that we fight against don't play by those rules. And if you're not careful as a warrior, it's easy to devolve to the level of violence that your enemy is willing to go to. But I contend that as a Christian, we don't get that option. Because although we are part of a state, and Romans 13 is very clear, a God-ordained government, and even the sword that God has given the government, the military, law enforcement, that's all part of God's gift to society. Still doesn't give me the right to do whatever my enemies would do to me on a battlefield. So I recognize I have a higher authority that I have to answer to. Sure, maybe what I'm about to do is perfectly justified using the rules of engagement. But even though the rules of engagement give me the authority to take this life, maybe I shouldn't. Because my God in heaven, the just judge who sees everything, maybe he knows that this person doesn't need to die. And it takes tremendous willpower not to pull the trigger, especially when you fear for your life. The first reaction, the easiest thing to do is to pull the trigger just to save your own skin. It takes immense restraint. I think supernatural restraint, not to pull the trigger when your enemy is doing something evil to you. And I have the legal justification to do this, but maybe not the moral justification before a holy God. And I got infinite war stories that I could tell there, but I'll just leave it with that.
Okay, so I'm going to go to Dr. Heimbach on this. Probably another one of the gold nuggets that you all can know from this is probably one of the foremost thinkers from a Christian point of view on how to try to understand a crusade or jihadist perspective. Dan's done a lot of really good work in this. So Dan, feel free to speak to this past question, or if you could you give us a kind of succinct understanding of what does it mean to have a crusade or jihadist kind of perspective?
It's easy to give pat, short answers, but they usually aren't the most helpful answers to give. I say that to preface the observation that crusade is very easy and popular to be against crusade. And the reality is that more blood has been shed motivated by an ideology of crusade in the history of the human race than any other approach. Even when people didn't have the word on their lips, that's how they were thinking. When you're Jeff and I want to talk, when you're trying to rev up the emotions of soldiers going into battle so they're willing to put their lives on the line, the easiest way is to demonize your enemy. Mm-hmm. The easiest way is to get them to hate the enemy. The easiest way is to get them to view the enemy as subhuman, as devil dogs or, evil, not deserving of human respect, and so forth. That ideology, that way of speaking comes from crusade, okay? Because what characterizes crusade, in contrast to just war, is that crusade is a perfectionist ideology. Any ideology that is going to war with an ideological framework or motivation is a crusade ideology, because you're going for you're using deadly force to bring about an ideal that's never been achieved before in life, And the thing is, when you're doing that, war never ends because you never realize any social ideal in the world that we live in. Okay, but it's easy to get people against crusade. Oh, that's horrible. Or it's easy to get people to riled up in support of their particular ideology. A A lot of what's going on in politics in America, dividing our presidential election, is over a ideology that's willing to demonize the other side, no matter how extreme you state, to try to get them to hate the other side, rather than to be balanced, rather than to look for objective. Okay, so get back on track. In contrast, just war is a realist ethic. It's an ethic of restraint, realizing that nothing's perfect. And because we live in a mixed society, we can imagine a society where nobody is bad and nobody is, but we can't ever get there. All we can do is restrain it. So it's an ethic of restraining within limits that understands the the fallenness of human nature, as well as the impossibility of bringing about any kind of perfect social situation. So, is there crusade in the Bible? Well, yes, there is. Is there crusade in the Bible that God, that I worship, supports in the Old Testament? Yes, there is. In the New Testament, well, the Battle of Armageddon is going to be crusade too. So there you got that at the end of the Bible. So does that mean that we can decide to fight this war on a just war footing and then fight a crusade and make the world safe for democracy in another setting? And the answer is no. The Bible has never given crusade as an option for human rulers to pursue at their discretion. God never has done that. He ordered the people of Israel on a crusade, but when he did, he led it. That was the whole issue. I'm leading it. You do it my way, and if you're not if you're not following me, you lose. That's why they lost at Ai. Okay? Because they hadn't followed God. So, if God shows up and says, I'm launching a crusade, join me, and you can see it and verify it, then you can do it. But until he does that, it's not authorized. It's not a human option. The only thing we can do is the best we can in restraining evil in a way that makes it less than it would be otherwise, and that's just war.
Okay, great, excellent. So in a just war mentality, there's a couple principles of ethics that are always fundamental to them. One of those is the sanctity of human life. And that really works on two ways, because the sanctity of human life applies to those who are about to be killed as well as the ones that are being protected. So the hardest part for the just warrior is to determine when is that amount of force necessary in order to protect the life of the innocent or the people who are being abused. How do we protect them? Is lethal force necessary in this context? And then if so, what kind of that? So there's a couple things that are important for us. A just warrior always takes the perspective of one of my favorite old Western movies. If any of you guys ever like to watch Westerns, Danny Glover is in a movie called Silverado. It's a great movie. Watch Silverado just for the fun of it at some time. But in one scene in there, he says, in essence, what the just warrior always says, and that is this phrase: I don't want to kill you, and you don't want to be dead. And behind that kind of thinking is an honoring of the sanctity of human life. A just warrior never wants to take a life. So this is why if you ever see a president declare war or discuss why the United States is in a war context, it will always be kind of a somber, a little bit even sad tone to the president's kind of regret that I have to do this, and yet be fully justified with the sense of, okay, but this is going to happen, and so we can do this without losing sleep, right? This is one of the things, most amazing things this guy's ever said to me is after these situations, he slept well. And I don't understand that because I've never been in a live war setting. But a just warrior can do that while at the same, sometimes having the regret and yet at the same time the justification. Now the way that that's typically done is through two primary categories. I'll give you the Latin phrase and the English translation, and then a third category is oftentimes used. One of those is called jus ad bellum, J-U-S-A-D-B-E-L-L-U-M, and that is in English basically reasons to go to war. So you have to justify your reasons to go to war, but then once you're in a war, from a just war perspective, then you have something called jus in bello, or J-U-S-I-N-B-E-L-L-O, jus in bello, and that's how do you behave once you're in war. And then there's a question of that when the war is over, is there another thing which would be jus post-war? So is there something that we should do after war is done in order to help care for the people who've been the victims on either side of that particular context? So Dan, you want to speak real briefly to this category of justice in going to war? And then, if you don't mind, justice when you're in war.
Well, there are a number of principles that have been developed over time, and the just war ethic as an approach to dealing with war and peace in a responsible way is a very, very ancient, very, very old ethical tradition that goes back at least 2,500 years, maybe as far back as 4,000. Because even Abraham was using a just war ethic at one point that I can show you in the Bible. So, although he wasn't using the title. So it's been around a very, very long time. And but it's been an evolving tradition. So there's no one place to go to and say, this is the Bible and just war, here are the official. Because every book that you pick up and read is going to have a slightly different version of what the principles are, and some have more and some have less. In what I've written up, I've included everything that can be found, I think, in the literature, but I haven't made up anything new. I've just reported what's in the tradition, but it's a longer list than anybody else posts. Okay, so that includes proportionality. No, that's the wrong side. Okay, just cause, going to war, must be be addressing an act of injustice that going to war will correct. Competent authority, the deciding has to be on the shoulders of the ones in charge of the community, not just any rabble-rouser. Comparative justice in the real world, sometimes, there are issues on both sides. And if you're a decision maker, you need to consider whether there is more justice at stake on their side than our side, because it isn't right to go to battle to cause more harm than good. Right intention, this oftentimes gets confused with the right spirit. Dr. Liederbach was talking about the right spirit, having a spirit of regret. But right intention is not about how you feel about it. Right intention is the result you're aiming for, and that is to restore a tranquil relationship between the two nations. It's not creating a perfect world, it's not creating perfect relations, but at least restoring what was there before they got upset with each other. So right intention has to be aiming at that, not because you're angry at them, or you're going to show them, or you're going to increase the glory of Rome or something like that. Last resort, if there's a way of solving the problem without using deadly force, then you should prefer that. But also that needs to be interpreted in a realistic way, because you can always wait longer, send another delegation and so forth. But if that's the case, you'll never get there. So last resort becomes interminable. So it has to be realistically interpreted, given a fair chance. And if they don't respond, at this point, then we have no other option but to go to war. Probability of success, proportionality, projected results. You don't want to go to war if it's going to cost more than it's worth, even if you can win it. And right spirit, which has an ad bellum as well as an in bello version.
So one of the live applications of what Dr. Heimbach just spelled out for us is, I remember many of you are as I'm looking around in the room, are probably too young to remember this. Some of you who are closer to my age may. But when George Bush went on television and said, we're about ready to have war in the Persian Gulf, and the way he said it is, I'm going to use the visual, he didn't use it, but we're going to draw a line in the sand, was the phrase. And the idea with that was, at last resort, we're going to do everything we can. We're going to mobilize a coalition of nations. We're going to do embargoes. We're going to do everything we can. But at some point, there's a line in the sand that if action isn't done according to what's being asked of you, then we will go in. So that's where just the last resort, you have to have some kind of endpoint for that. Once you've made the decision to go to war, reluctant as you are to go to war, there's a reluctancy to behave. I don't know if that's not the right phrase. There's principles that are governing your behavior when you're in war. So Jeff, talk a little bit about this.
I should say my first combat experience, every time the U.S. goes to war, there is an operational title to this war. And after the war's over with, you retire that title, never ever used again. My first combat experience was against a Christian nation. The invasion of Panama in 1989, the operational title was Operation Just Cause. When George H.W. Bush committed forces to Panama to depose the Panamanian president, Manuel Noriega, the operational title for this war was Just Cause. There's a just cause to go do this. When you're in war, there's basically There are a couple of ways that a just warrior conducts themselves, but the easiest way to think through this is to remember the person that I'm fighting against is created in the image of God, has inherent value and worth as a human being in God's eyes, and is an eternal soul that will go on forever. If a warrior keeps that in mind, then you don't demonize the enemy. Then you don't turn the enemy into something subhuman. Then you don't use an unnecessary amount of force. In other words, you'll be proportionate in the way that you fight, and you will limit yourself intentionally and not cause more harm than you have to. Warriors always protect innocent, just warriors do. They never ever use the power of lethal force for their own selfish good. But the truth is, war has been a great cause of injustice, and it's the reasons why we go to war, as Dr. Liederbach just described, but also the way warriors have conducted themselves. And if you go to any VFW or American Legion in America tonight, you will see warriors drinking themselves to sleep because they can't live with themselves from the way that they conducted themselves in war. And what Christian just warriors do is you conduct yourself in such a way that you know when you stand before a holy God, you have nothing to be ashamed of. So you have no need to drink yourself to sleep every night for the rest of your life. That's layman's terms.
Yeah, good. So the principles typically, they're in some order, typically, and I think Dr. Heimbach and I would have written very similar on this, the principles of justice in war. So again, you have a hard criteria on when you go to war, but then when you're in war, there's always a discrimination, is the first terminology. You discriminate between those who are actual targets in war and civilians. So you always try to keep that as clean as you possibly can. It's really difficult, however, if the enemy is a jihadist and they're arming their children with dynamite and having them ride bikes up to the gate, right? That changes how a just warrior fights there. It's very difficult, right? The second version of this is that a just warrior will never use evil means. And so then you have to determine what those means are. And that's where the question of whether or not waterboarding or something like that is actually evil in itself or could be used. That's where a lot of debates happen, is on that one. The third one is proportionality. So proportionality is both, is this war something I can do? Is it a proportional thing that we think we can actually achieve what we're doing with what it's going to cost us? But then when you're in particular battles, you're asking that question as well. So those are some of the more particulars if you're interested. And again, some of our notes and writings can flesh that out. So we've got two other questions that are going to be really quick in our answers, and then we're going to open it up for Q&A for you all. But let me throw this out to you guys. Let's see if we can get through at least one of them on that. And let's bring this to modern day. We currently are watching, and it's even part of the election, we got a war in Ukraine, and we got a war in the Gaza Strip. I'm just going to leave it as open as that. What are you guys' thoughts? And do you even want to venture forward on these? So let's start with Israel. What do we do in the case of Israel being attacked? Now they're at war, and you're seeing the political rhetoric that's going on in there.
You want to start with this one?
Sure.
This is when it's great to be the question asker. And
It's easy to blow smoke and say, well, it's difficult. But if anybody has the resources to think through it, it should be the three folks who are sitting up here. Not that we are perfect or have all the answers, but we should have a repertoire to pull from. So let's talk about Israel. What's dividing people the most is, why don't you stop? Why don't you pull out of Gaza?
Yeah.
Why don't you agree to some kind of a peace treaty? Well, it's not that Israel is against a peace treaty. They're against the kind of peace treaty that the other side agrees to and won't change. Should they care about that or should they not? I want to explain why they should care about it. Because there's been a very long history, years and years and years, in which there has been war between the Palestinians and the state of Israel, in which they have made some unjust attack. There has been some, horrible scenes in the news, and then the Palestinians say, "Please, stop shooting us. We're just, innocent people." And so Israel will say, okay, we'll give you a chance, and they'll sign a peace accord, only for them to come back a few years later and fight. And then they say, oh, stop fighting. So it's a strategy of the crusade mentality of the Palestinians to use the idea of proportionality against Israel. That is, okay, we give up. Now, if it was between, other wars in the history of the West, or even in the Middle East, when one side gives up, they stop fighting and they settle. And that means the war is over. In the Palestinian mind, which is a jihadist crusade, that's just a ploy to get you to stop killing until we can get our forces strong enough to keep fighting. It's not an agreement to stop fighting. And if you want us to say that it is, we'll lie. Because in their mind, they are never agreeing to stop until Israel's gone. And they've made that very, very clear over and over, that they are not stopping the fight until there's no Israel. Okay? So, it's just saying, stop fighting, we're giving up, is not what it looks like to, peace-loving people in the West. Oh, they're just tired of fighting, give them a chance. Because they've made it very clear they don't mean that. And so, Israel's in a situation where the only way they can stop the kind of attack that happened on October 7th a year ago, the only way to stop it, that is given to them by the Palestinian people, by Hamas, is to get rid of Hamas. Because Hamas is the driving factor that will keep them fighting and keep them fighting and keep them fighting and just retrench until they get enough and keep fighting. So if you want to stop them from doing it again, the only way is to get rid of the people who are planning to do it again. And the only way to do that is to get rid of Hamas. Are there people in Palestine or in Gaza who would love just to go back to a tranquil relationship and get along with each other? Yeah, there are. But they're not the ones in charge. And so the only way for Israel to make sure that October 7th doesn't happen again, after giving, 30 chances already of the same thing, is to say, we're not going to do that again. We're going to fight until there's no Hamas. Because they're the ones that are keeping at it. So that's why, now, if there's a peace settlement that really is believable from people who are saying, we don't agree with Hamas's ideology, we support Israel's right to exist, we just want to get along and trade and so forth like that, as a nation against other nations, Israel would agree to that. But that's not on the table yet.
You want to add anything?
Yeah, I would agree with everything that he said. And if I could just jump in on the side of war against terrorism, a terrorist gives up their right to life when they attack innocents, because using fear by killing innocent people is basically an attack against all free people on the planet. You can apply the same logic, though, to Ukraine and to Russia. If one sovereign country rolls across the borders of another sovereign country, declares that this country actually belongs to us and we're going to take this country back, that's an assault against the national boundaries of every sovereign country, which means every country on the planet has a vested interest in what happens in Ukraine right now. Because what's to stop it from being Poland or from being Czechoslovakia or someplace else the next day? So,
which is what Hitler did.
Yeah. So what I'm saying is, I'm not a globalist, but we all have a little skin in both of these games.
And then the only thing I would add, and we'll turn it over to Mark now for Q&A, is Rob, is that the behavior in war, okay, so the use in bello still applies. So there could be that there's unjust means happening along the way that wouldn't necessarily mean that they're disqualified for being in war at all, right? So the justification to be in the war is one thing. If you're asking questions about whether or not people should be killed at certain times, or whatever, that's more nuanced and that's hard, and that's the use in bello category. So it's feasible that you can be in war for the right reason and doing poor things in war. And that's where some of this debate is also coming about. These guys have just spoken to the more of the reasons to go to war and why both places it's justified to be there. So anyway, that just a quick thought.